भारत सरकार के फॉर्मर चीफ इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर कृष्णमूर्ति सुब्रमण्यम आईआईटी कानपुर और आईआईएम कैलकाटा के अलमनस रहे हैं। करेंटली वो आईएमएफ में एग्जीक्यूटिव डायरेक्टर की पोजीशन पर हैं। He has estimated in his new book that India will be a $55 trillion economy by 2047, which is double of what others have predicted. उन्होंने Amazon India के साथ बात की Amazon Book Talks के इस एपिसोड में।
EY estimates that India's GDP will be $26 trillion by 2047. Goldman Sachs forecasts India's GDP to be about 50 trillion by 2075. You have said that India at 100, which is 2047, which is the 100th year of India's independence. You have forecasted that the economy will be
55 trillion
by 2047.
Yeah.
Why is your prediction so different from these institutes?
See, I think it's a simple point. If you have to estimate the value of the GDP in dollar terms, you have to have an estimation for the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar. Okay. The big difference between what I have assessed and what the other assessments that you mentioned about is about the assessment of the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar. What these assessments have done is basically just extrapolated from the past.
Okay.
If you look at in the past from 1991 till 2016 or so, I'll talk about 2016 why that is important. The rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar has been about 3.5% per annum.
Okay.
So they've just it's like take that and extrapolate it going forward, but that does not take into account a very important macroeconomic development that happened in India in 2016 when India implemented the inflation targeting regime. As a result, inflation has declined significantly for India. From 1991 to 2016, the average inflation in India has been about more than 7%, close to 7.5%. From 2016 onwards, because of the inflation targeting regime, which requires the central bank to target inflation at 4%, plus minus 2, so there's a band of 2% to 6%. The average inflation, despite COVID, despite Ukraine war and all the supply side problems as a result of that, has been 5%. In other words, despite these problems, inflation has declined at least by about 2.5%.
Okay.
Now, this importantly implies an implication for the rate of depreciation. Why? Let's understand it conceptually. What does inflation do? Inflation actually reduces the value of the purchasing power of your currency in nominal terms, right? In other words, if I basically have, let's say, 100 rupees now, I can buy 100 rupees worth of goods or services. But next year, with 5% inflation, I can only buy goods or services worth 95 rupees. In contrast, if I actually take the United States, where inflation has been on, let's say, about 2%, if you can buy goods worth $100 now, next year you can buy goods worth $98. In other words, the erosion in the value of the currency is lower when inflation is lower. To maintain the purchasing power in some sense, actually, therefore the currency that faces higher inflation has to depreciate more. Okay. In other words, there is actually a one-for-one match in some sense between the inflation and the difference in inflation between two countries and the rate of depreciation. Now, as I said, inflation has declined from about 7.5% to 5%. That has to translate one for one into actually a lower rate of depreciation going forward. My assessment is that the inflation in India will actually be about 5% going forward, which means that you have to subtract 2.5% at least from the rate of depreciation that has prevailed in the past. That gives you 1% rate of depreciation. Now, this with the power of compounding, which is something which over long periods, compounding is very important. So even small differences can make a big difference in terms of the multiple. So I'll illustrate why now precisely using numbers how you see the difference. So if you take, for instance, real growth to be, let's say, 8%, inflation to be 5%, as I just explained to you, that means in nominal rupee terms that's 13%, 8 plus 5. Right. Okay. But when you assess in dollar terms, you have to actually account for appreciation or depreciation.
Right.
And because depreciation reduces the value in dollars, you have to subtract that. So, as I said, in my assessment, as I explained to you, the rate of depreciation is likely to be about 1% or less. Let's take it to be 1%. 13% minus 1% is 12%. Now, there is this rule of 72 that tells you basically how many years it's going to take to double your money. So you divide 72 by a rate of compounding, it gives you a number of years. So 72 divided by 12 is 6 years. So at 12% rate of growth in dollar terms, GDP will multiply every 6 years. And over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, there is basically 4 6-year periods, right? So there are 4 doublings there.
Right.
And that means, 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, which is 2 to the power 4, that's 16 times. And that's what takes you from 3.25, which 3.28 has been the GDP, India's GDP in 2023. In 2023, let's approximate it to 3.25. So the first doubling is from 3.25 to 6.5, second doubling from 6.5 to 13, third doubling from 13 to 26, and the fourth doubling from 26 to 52. Okay, so that is my prediction. Now let's see the same thing actually. If you do not take into account this important macroeconomic change and assume the rate of depreciation to be same as 3.5%.
Right.
Okay. Let's say you take growth at 8% or 7%. Let's take it as 8%. Inflation at 5% as well, 13%. Subtract 3.5%. So now you actually your rate of growth is 9.5%. So at about 9.5%, your compounding actually doubling happens about every 8 years, because 9 times 8 is 72.
72, right.
It's 24-year period again. Now 3 doublings instead of 4 doublings. So see now the power of compounding, that instead of going up to 4 doublings, you only get 3 doublings. So you go from 3.25 to 6.5, 6.5 to 13, 13 to 26, and stop at 26. That is basically what explains the Ernst & Young prediction. So it is actually the most important is, in my opinion, I think that is something if you purview the economy well and understand the importance of important macroeconomic developments like the inflation targeting regime being in place, I don't think you will actually extrapolate like this without having taken into account that important change, and that is where the difference is.
Okay, so the average rate should be around 7 to 8%. The GDP growth. GDP
growth actually, if 8% is what I'm pushing for, because if you look at historically over the last 30 years from 1991 onwards, when we liberalized the economy, we've grown at about 7%. Right. So 7% is something that we've actually registered, we've been able to produce, and that is despite all the challenges that we've had. We've emerged from a socialist era. The first few years after liberalization, growth was still not very high. Right. We still hadn't only starting from 2018 onwards, and 2014, and it's accelerated from 2020 onwards that we've built infrastructure. Our infrastructure hadn't been that good. There are things we have to improve on: education, healthcare, judiciary, bureaucracy. Despite all of those challenges, you still have grown at 7%. So I think that with a little bit more ambition, with a little bit of a stretch goal, we actually can hit 8%. And at 8% growth, as I just explained, with the 5% inflation, instead of the 7.5% inflation that has prevailed in the past, rate of depreciation will be lower, and that will take us to 55 trillion.
Okay, so I have one doubt on this, because as the economy grows, for example, I'll take the example of USA. Because if I'm not wrong, it grows by 3% or something, 2 to 3%.
Yeah.
India is growing at 7 to 8% from a lot of years. So
correct.
My doubt is that because as the economy grows, of course, the rate will also be reducing. As the large economy becomes, the growth is. So what I'm asking, because even if the growth, we'll see the examples of Korea and Taiwan, the tiger economies, they were growing at 10% because they were smaller economies as compared to India, the size of it.
So here's, I get your question.
Yeah, I think my question is that can we actually consistently go at 7 to 8%?
Yeah. So see, implicit in this is an economic principle that all of us have learned, which is the law of diminishing returns. So what you're actually expressing is, your returns at higher GDP, your returns basically will, it's like what we in technical terms say like concavity, which is the rate of growth basically declines as you grow, reach higher levels. Now, this is something which actually, it's really important because of course, while writing this book, as an economist, of course, I'm aware of the law of diminishing returns. So I reflected on this particular aspect very deeply. And this reflection actually, illuminated to me was that most of us, we've learnt our economics, in some sense from the growth phenomena that have prevailed primarily in advanced economies, in Western economies. Right. And I think it is important when we when we talk about the Indian economy, we have to, while the principles remain the same, the differences in the nature of the economy I think are important to take into account. And I think many times we actually do not do that sort of extrapolation, or do not, in some sense, we sort of do not remove the blinkers that we've been put on through learning economics, from research done on advanced economies. So here it is important to to understand that in general growth comes from two sources. One is whether it's at the at an individual level, at a firm level, industry or country level. It is essentially about how much investment are you making and what is the return you're making on that investment. The multiplication of that. So if you invest more, keeping your return on the investment the same, you'll grow faster. And keeping your investment rate the same, if you're actually generating a higher return on that investment, again you'll actually grow faster. These are the and at the macroeconomic level, these are basically, the concept is the same, but the term that is used is actually, it is you say gross fixed capital formation to GDP, which is nothing but investment rate. And then you say incremental capital output ratio, which is basically for every incremental unit of output, to generate, how much capital do you need? What incremental? Is that basically nothing but productivity? So when you think about it, and this framing is important to understand both the differences and the similarities in terms of with advanced economies. So the first thing to recognize in advanced economies is that they've, in the last 50, 60 years, they've been pretty much formal. They've been formalized. They don't have a large informal sector the way India has. India has a very large informal sector, and the implications of that, I'll actually make it clear. Equally, most of these countries have actually built their bridges, their ports, their airports and stuff like that. And they've sort of trained their education, etc. As a result, their investment levels are also almost saturated.
Right.
So productivity productivity shocks are the ones that have actually delivered growth for them. So for instance, if you take the 1990s, the internet shock basically increased productivity. That shock lasted for a while. They actually generated growth. Then in 2000s it was basically outsourcing manufacturing to China, outsourcing services to India. And now people are talking about generative AI, for instance. So it's primarily productivity shocks that have actually delivered growth in the advanced economies. Here's where India is different, because India can grow without these productivity shocks itself, and there are three primary sources that I want to lay out. First is we have a very large informal sector. Estimates vary because you can't measure it very precisely, the informal sector. Anywhere between half to 2/3, and some estimates may even put it at 3/4 of the economy is still informal. Why does this matter? Because productivity in the formal sector is always higher than productivity in the informal sector. So just the formalization of the economy will actually, enhance productivity. That's the first driver. And there's a big driver which is not there in the, and this is something that maybe until we get fully formalized, the diminishing returns will start hitting after we become fully formalized. My sense is that because we have about at least half of the economy, or maybe even 3/4, right, is still informal. It will take about 20-25 years for us to fully formalize this. So in that entire period, we will be reaping the reward from basically productivity growth, number one. Number two, if you look at the formal sector itself, and this is another thing which actually is not there. As I said, their firms have been at the frontier, and so it is productivity shocks that have basically pushed that frontier. But for India, actually, Indian firms still need to catch up with the frontier. And here's where innovation and entrepreneurship become really critical, because even our formal sector firms are maybe about half as productive, some firms 1/3 as productive as their global peers. They'll catch up. And here innovation and entrepreneurship will play a very critical role, where there's been already some momentum, and I'll talk about some data on that. But so that will be the second driver. And third, which is credit creation. Here as well, advanced economies have always mostly been saturated. They've given whatever amount of credit to a large extent. At the margins they could change a little bit, but on average not that much. But India, if you take for instance, extent of credit creation as a percentage of GDP, for every 100 units of GDP in the advanced economies, credit has been about 180 units. In other words, 1.8 times GDP. In India, same 2020, that data is for 2020 for the world. India, for every 100 units of GDP, our credit is only 58 units. In other words, so while they've done about 1.8 times their GDP, we've only done 0.58 times GDP of credit. And credit is actually is a lifeblood of an economy. Because when credit is given for asset creation, that actually leads to investment. It also leads to productivity improvements and thereby growth. And look at the runway there is that we have, and given the public digital infrastructure that we've created, the account aggregator, the UPI, we have the OCN now, all the fintechs, basically the kind of data that's, and from the vantage point that I actually see at the IMF, IMF analyzes close to 200 economies. There isn't another economy like India that has the kind of digital infrastructure that India has. And no country, even the advanced economy, is getting close to India in the next 10-15 years at least. So this is an unprecedented opportunity for India to leapfrog and basically utilize this huge runway in credit creation. So these are things actually where the law of diminishing returns will not hit. Because we will just be catching up to the frontier. Diminishing returns starts hitting when you're at the frontier, and so there is actually an importance. And you gave examples of South Korea. You gave examples of here. I want to actually, we have a very large population. So we actually, when the population actually their labor productivity improves. For the same population, given Malthus's theory, most of us actually have these blinkers thinking about population as a curse. But when you actually provide jobs and you enable them, population can actually be a big boon, and I've covered that in great detail. So which is why it's a combination of these things, which is why I do not think, and as I said, actually I reflected on this very, very deeply, and I actually, taking into account the differences of the Indian economy vis-a-vis advanced economies, I think that in the next at least 20-25 years, it's unlikely we will hit the law of diminishing returns yet. From 2450 onwards, we still may. But despite that, because predicting anything, especially over 20-25 years, actually it does involve uncertainty. Yes. And that's why I've actually provided other scenarios too. Even if India grows at 6% on average in real terms, and that can happen. So let's say, let me accommodate the possibility that, diminishing return sets in. We grow at, let's say, 7% the next 10 years, and we grow only at 5% for the residual period. We will still have an average of 6%. So even then we will be a $30 trillion economy. Okay. So these are important things to to keep in mind. The problem is most of us actually do not sort of remove these blinkers. We don't think out of the box. Most of the thinking is in the box that we've been taught using basically advanced economies, and that the fresh thought that is required by taking into account economic principles, but applying it carefully, rigorously, diligently to the Indian economy, by taking into account the difference in the economic features. That is what actually leads to that sort of clear thinking, and using that, I'm convinced that I don't think the law of diminishing returns will be hitting in till we completely get formalized. Number one, till basically our firms become as productive as the global peers, and till our credit basically reaches the same as global levels, which I think that can take 2025. So there is actually enough opportunity for us.
Okay. What are the criticisms of this present government, जो मैंने भी देखा है, which is that even after visible economic growth, the job creation is not in parallel with that. A lot of criticism they have faced about that.
ये मैं इससे सहमत नहीं हूँ. Okay. मैं actually इसमें जहाँ तक रोजगार की बात है, मेरा मानना है कि आंकड़े जो हैं, आप यदि आंकड़े अच्छे सही सोर्सेस से आप देखें, तो इसमें जो नैरेटिव है, और वो भी नेगेटिव नैरेटिव्स एक्चुअली हैव प्रीसीडेड द रियलिटी. एंड मैं आंकड़ों से आपको बताता हूँ, आई विल कन्विंस यू कि आप देखो, जैसे PLFS का भी डेटा आई है, ठीक है, पिछले हफ्ते. वैसे ही RBI ने विश्लेषण किया था यूजिंग द क्लेम्स डेटाबेस. एंड क्लेम्स डेटाबेस अगेन, मैं क्योंकि अभी IMF में हम लोग इस्तेमाल करते हैं, क्लेम्स डेटाबेस सिर्फ भारत के लिए नहीं, बाकी देशों के लिए भी इस्तेमाल होता है, और ये काफ़ी हाई क्वालिटी डेटाबेस है. और RBI इंडिपेंडेंट इंस्टीट्यूशन है, उन्होंने एक्चुअली क्या विश्लेषण लगाया, उनका एनालिसिस बतलाता है कि आप पिछले 10 साल में देखें तो कृषि में जो आपके रोजगार हुआ, उसको मैं अभी के लिए एक्चुअली उसको अलग रखता हूँ. यानी कृषि में जो रोजगार बना है उसको मैं काउंट नहीं कर रहा हूँ, उसको इंक्लूड नहीं कर रहा हूँ. तब भी 10 साल में 9 करोड़ नौकरियां बनी हैं. 9 करोड़, यानी कि हर साल करीब 90 लाख. ठीक है, ये जो इसमें एम्प्लॉयमेंट में जो रोजगार में जो नेगेटिव नैरेटिव्स बनती हैं, ये मेरे अनुसार मुख्यतः इसीलिए क्योंकि हम ये गलत और इसमें अनरिलायबल डेटाबेस सीएमआई का इस्तेमाल करते हैं। मैंने जब मैं सरकार में था और उसके बाद भी मैंने एक्चुअली ऐसा पेपर भी लिखा है उसमें कि सीएमआई की डेटा में उसमें जो है वो रिलायबल नहीं है। अब मैं ये बताता हूँ कि जब मैं सरकार में था, जब सीएमआई की डेटा ये बतलाती थी कि अरे अच्छा रोजगार बना है, तब भी मैं उसमें विश्वास नहीं करता था। वो अच्छी न्यूज आए या खराब न्यूज, मैं एक्चुअली उसमें मुझे नहीं पता कि वो सही आंकलन लगा रहे हैं, क्योंकि जो सर्वे मेथोडोलॉजी है वो उसमें काफी सारे प्रॉब्लम्स हैं। मैंने सीएमआई के डेटा से एक्चुअली जब मैं असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर था उनके डेटा के साथ बहुत इंटेंसिवली काम किया है। तो इसीलिए फाइनेंशियल डेटा में, जैसे मैं बताता हूँ आपको कि करीब 10-15 साल पहले जब सीएमआई की डेटा इंडिया के लिए इस्तेमाल करता था फाइनेंशियल, मैंने आज के तारीख में डाउनलोड किया डेटा और मैंने अपना एनालिसिस किया, रिग्रेशन चलाया। ठीक है, मैंने एक कॉन्फ्रेंस के लिए पेपर भेजा, कॉन्फ्रेंस में पेपर डिस्कस हुआ, कुछ कमेंट्स वगैरह आए, आज मुझे कुछ और थोड़ा चेंज करके रिग्रेशन रन करना है। मैंने डेटा दोबारा डाउनलोड किया। तो बाकी किसी आप ऐसी जैसे वर्ल्ड में अच्छे डेटाबेस क्वालिटी आप डाउनलोड करते हैं, तो आज जो डेटा डाउनलोड किया, कल जो डेटा डाउनलोड किया, दोनों समानांतर एकदम वैसे के वैसे होते हैं। लेकिन सीएमआई के डेटा में मैंने उनके साथ काम किया, उनको एक्चुअली बतलाया था, आप 1 महीने बाद डाउनलोड करो, एक्चुअली डेटा अलग है। डेटा अलग है, और ये मैं अनुभव से बता रहा हूं। तो ये क्यों? क्योंकि प्राइवेट सेक्टर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, उनको कॉस्ट कटिंग करनी है। तो लेकिन मैं उनको लिखता था और बताता था कि यदि एकेडमिक एकेडमिक पेपर के लिए ये तो मतलब एकदम बहुत ही मुश्किल बात है। यदि चाहते हैं कि एकेडमिक्स और पॉलिसी मेकर्स इस डेटा का इस्तेमाल करें, तो ये जो इश्यू आप फिक्स करें। तो तब इतने बार बतलाने के बाद उन्होंने फाइनेंशियल डेटा में फिक्स किया। लेकिन आज के तारीख में सर्वे मेथोडोलॉजी में जो एक्चुअली उनकी प्रॉब्लम्स हैं, वही वैसे ही किसी को इंटेंशनली बैठ के उनको बतलाना है कि भैया आपका डेटा आप एक्चुअली टाइमली तो आता है, लेकिन उस डेटा में रिलायबिलिटी नहीं है। और स्टेटिस्टिकल मेजर्स में एक्चुअली स्टेटिस्टिक में कौन सी होता है? कोएफिशिएंट ऑफ वेरिएशन। कोएफिशिएंट ऑफ वेरिएशन यानी कि एक्चुअली स्टैंडर्ड डिविएशन डिवाइडेड बाय मीन। स्टैंडर्ड डिविएशन आपका कितना, वेरिएबिलिटी कितना है वो बतलाता है। तो मैंने जो विश्लेषण में देखा है कि सीएमआई की डेटा में कोएफिशिएंट ऑफ वेरिएशन जो है वो बहुत ज्यादा है कंपेयर टू पीएलएफएस। एक और इसमें यानी कि रिलायबिलिटी उतना, वेरिएंस बहुत ज्यादा है। दूसरा, इकोनॉमिक्स में एक लॉ होता है, ओकुन्स लॉ कहते हैं, मतलब जागन है, लेकिन सिंपल कॉन्सेप्ट ये है कि जब, जैसे आपने इस प्रश्न में ही पूछा था और बतलाया इसमें कि जब आपका जीडीपी ग्रोथ होता है तो रोजगार भी बढ़ता है, बस यही ओकुन्स लॉ यही है। तो अभी ईपीडब्ल्यू में एक पेपर छपा था एक्चुअली मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ फाइनेंस के, उन्होंने एक्चुअली, और मैं जब मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार था, उन्होंने ये दिखाया कि यदि आप पीएलएफएस का डेटा लें, जो जिस टाइम पीरियड उन्होंने एनालाइज किया था, तो पीएलएफएस का डेटा में इस जो कोरिलेशन है एम्प्लॉयमेंट का जीडीपी के ग्रोथ के साथ, वो सही है इस लॉ के अनुरूप। जबकि आप सीएमआई का डेटा लें तो ये एकदम उल्टा है कि सीएमआई के डेटा में जीडीपी ग्रोथ हो रही है और एम्प्लॉयमेंट एक्चुअली नेगेटिव चल रहा है, कोरिलेशन नेगेटिव चल रहा है। तो इसमें तो दोनों डेटा में एक्चुअली तो किसमें विश्वास करेंगे? उसमें जो कि स्मेल टेस्ट पास करता है। स्मेल टेस्ट पीएलएफएस पास करता है, सीएमआई पास नहीं करता। तो ये धारणा मैं तो कई बार बतलाता हूं, लेकिन तब भी कुछ शायद वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट हैं जिनको इसी धारणा को लगे हुए रहने में, उसमें एक्चुअली उनको शायद आनंद आता है। तो लेकिन इसमें आंकड़ों पे आप ध्यान दें। और ये एक बात लाता हूँ, इंटरनेशनल लेबर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, इंटरनेशनल लेबर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का जो रिपोर्ट आया इंडिया में, उन्होंने सीएमआई का डेटा इस्तेमाल किया? नहीं। सीएमआई का एक, आप उस रिपोर्ट में जाके एक सर्च करें, सीएमआई एक बार भी अपेयर हो जाए तो बता दे मेरे को। लेकिन वो कौन सा डेटा इस्तेमाल करते हैं? पीएलएफएस। सो इसका मतलब कि डेटा क्वालिटी किसकी अच्छी है? पीएलएफएस की है। पीएलएफएस की क्या डेटा बता, अभी पिछले हफ्ते जो आई है उसमें LFPR, लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन रेशियो, वर्कर पॉपुलेशन रेशियो, अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट, ऑन एवरी मेट्रिक, from compared to 2017-18, now actually, we are in a much better situation. So if you look at the facts, and I think the problem is most people are not looking at the facts, and if they are looking at the facts also, they're actually looking at, data that actually is not very reliable. And that is why this negative narrative that employment has not happened has actually gotten created, which in my opinion is not the reality.
Okay.
That said though, and let me add to this, I'm not saying that we should not be working on employment. We should be working on. In fact, some people will say, if indeed, let's say, the employment situation is not that bad, why is the government focusing on it? Why did they, do it in the budget?
Right.
Now, I think what I actually want to tell those viewers in general is that the real world is never binary like that. Which is that, if let's say I'm working hard after having gotten 95 marks in 100, just because I'm working hard, you look at me and say, hey, this guy must have failed in mathematics. That's a binary, that's not how the real world is.
Right.
That, even if let's say I've gotten 80 marks or 95, 90 marks, I still want to do better. I want to, and that is what the government is doing, and it should be doing as well. So this narrative that, if just because, the government is focusing on employment creation does means that, employment basically situation is bad. That is not a logical, conclusion, and it does not fit the data either.
Right. Okay. So, इसी से related, I want to ask something, because you have mentioned in your book, you have suggested 4 pillars of economic growth to achieve Prime Minister's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Correct.
उसमें आपने एक
And Viksit Bharat.
Yeah, Viksit Bharat. You have mentioned one thing in that you have written that from a provider of employment through its public sector enterprises, the state needs to transform fully into a catalyst for employment.
Correct.
पर इसमें एक चीज़ जो मुझे प्रॉब्लम जो मुझे दिखता है वो ये है कि माइंडसेट ऑफ अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल पब्लिक has to be changed before that, because अगर अचानक से जॉब कम होते हैं, people are like they go against
जॉब कम क्यों?
गवर्नमेंट जॉब्स I'm saying, क्योंकि of course पोजीशंस कम निकलेंगे, वैकेंसीज कम निकलेंगी गवर्नमेंट से बेसिस पे. तो क्या ये एक बहुत बड़ा टास्क नहीं है फॉर द गवर्नमेंट एंड इवन जो इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर्स हैं कि हम इसे कैसे टैकल करेंगे, बिकॉज पीपल विल नॉट वर्क फॉर द जॉब्स दैट आर इन द मार्केट. वो 3 साल 4 साल वेट करेंगे टू.
No, that's not true, right? If you, for instance, if you work with Amazon, right? Is Amazon a public sector company?
No, but
Amazon
I was
is a
not
private
thinking about going into private government sector. That's my
exactly.
thing is that.
That's I'm just saying, in this room, and maybe viewers will not be able to see it. There's we have a camera person sitting. We have actually each one of us here at this basically doesn't work for a government company. We actually work for the private sector. I work for the private sector. I work with the government as well. Why? Because private sector, oftentimes rewards talent, recognizes talent. So, and one of the things is, if you actually have, yes, there is some risk. If you don't do very well, you may be asked to basically, may not get a promotion. You may basically be asked to leave as well. But risk and reward go together too. And if you look at, in any economy that has grown, the bulk of jobs are created by the private sector. And I think this is also, I'll give you one more, because related to this is the other pillar that I've talked about, which is about wealth creation and ethical.
Right.
Given our socialist past, we, in India oftentimes tend to view wealth creation from a very jaundiced lens and, very negative manner. So I want to try and dispel some of these, notions, and therefore I want to give you, one specific example and then relate, to today's India based on that example. So I go back to the time when I was a child, as a kid. I come from a very humble family. My father was in the Indian Railways, in the clerical grades. I used to live in a type 2 quarters, Indian Railway quarters. And, we used to have, on some months, we actually, when, we used to get a house help to come and actually clean dishes for us. Some other months, we basically couldn't have it. But even in the months when there was a house help that used to come, this lady used to work in 9 other families. In other words, someone basically which was a lower middle class family, which wasn't creating much wealth, it was actually consuming wealth, right? Working for,
course, yeah.
wasn't creating wealth, was creating 1/10 of a house help's job, right? In contrast, the wealthiest person in our town, actually in Bilaspur, in Chhattisgarh, was a jeweler. This jeweler used to have, between his business and his home, he used to have 100 people working. And each one of those people was paid at least 5 to 6 times, maybe 10 times that the salary of basically a house help.
Right.
Now, what do you see here actually? A family or a economic unit that is not creating as much wealth is creating 1/10 of a house help's job. In contrast, a wealth creator is creating 100 jobs. In other words, the job creation is basically 1,000 times as much. Not just that, in terms of the earnings as well, the earnings from those jobs, that 1,000 times greater jobs, are actually at least 5 to 6 times more. So you can see that the correlation between wealth creation and job creation, and I think that is why I asked the question about don't you all work with private sector firms? Eventually think about it, even in India today, those people, many of us, all of us, if actually if Jeff Bezos did not create the wealth that he created, through Amazon, you wouldn't have a job, he wouldn't have a job, he wouldn't have a job either, right? Similarly, if Narayan Murthy in India did not create Infosys, I think all those people basically, maybe, viewers who are Infosys employees would not have a job. If Wipro had not created, so I can keep going on and take startups. Swiggy, for instance, if Swiggy was not there, all those people actually who now earn a living, who may have actually been in, may not have had as good, they might have been in villages, they wouldn't have had those jobs. We can keep going on. I think the important point to understand is that wealth creation correlates very, very significantly with job creation. This is something very important to understand. From this, let me actually speak about today, which is, and I say this with, absolute credibility, because I have not done a consulting for anyone. I've not taken a rupee from anybody, any industrialist, and therefore I can speak independently. Whether it is industrialist X, Y, or Z, whoever, rich people, do we think that industrialist X who's rich is basically stacking the money or their wealth in basically putting it in 2,000 rupee bills in his pillow and his mattress and sleeping? No. What is that person doing with his or her wealth? He's basically putting it in companies. Take Jeff Bezos, Amazon. Actually, what is he? He's putting it in companies which provides jobs to people like you. So I think this is something that is important to understand in India. And the reason this is important to understand is because we have a certain section of the polity that tries to actually keep, emphasizing again this old socialist era, thought that wealth creation is something that is evil. Okay. And that is something that has to be dispelled, because if you think about it, I'll give you an even more prosaic example. If you take a look at in our households, if we have let's say a small altar in our temple, and Navratri is coming, so actually, what do we write? We write Shubh Labh, right? Do we go and write there basically, we say Shubh and Hani? No, ऐसा तो नहीं लिखते ना, यानी कि क्या कि आप शुभ करो और उससे लाभ बनाओ. That is what a private sector, a wealth creator does. So I think these are important. If we understand these simple things well, those who try to pull wool on our eyes actually by saying wealth creation is evil, I think we can see their efforts very clearly then.
Although I don't believe wealth creation is evil, of course. But
no, I am not talking about you. If you were, I think that would be something would have been. You're working for Amazon, for God's sake. So.
I'm just pointing one problem with that, because
I don't even want to go there, because there's
not that. But
I might have to then possibly go and meet Jeff Bezos and talk about you.
No. So my problem is not wealth creation.
I was just kidding.
Yeah, but I have problem with wealth distribution, because of course percentage बहुत ज़्यादा differentiated है. So
again blinkers which I try to actually
But what I'm saying is it's a big challenge for government, क्योंकि एक dissatisfaction with the middle class को dissatisfaction with government is the taxation system as well. उन्हें लगता है कि हम पे टैक्स ज़्यादा लग रहा है, दूसरों पे नहीं लग रहा है. Government कैसे बैलेंस मेंटेन कर सकती है with respect to growth, because it also has to cater to a lot of things from the socialist era. अभी भी हम बहुत सारा socialist policy चलाते हैं. We give subsidies, we give free rations to people. इस बैलेंस को मेंटेन करते हुए with the growth rate that you have suggested that India should achieve, कैसे इसको पैदल हम बना के चल सकते हैं?
There are many aspects here actually that I want to talk about on this, because you have mixed almost 4-5 questions into one in this one. The first thing that I want to tell you actually is, because sort of without using the word inequality, you also, implicit in that was, and here again, we have to be careful that, and many youngsters unfortunately do this, which is they extrapolate from narratives that prevail in advanced economies without thinking about whether that is applicable to India.
Okay.
Take for instance the narrative on inequality, right? I've shown in the book, which is in the advanced economies, higher inequality correlates with actually lower socio-economic indicators. It could be crime rates, it could be actually mental health, it could be divorce rates and many other socio-economic indicators. Life expectancy, child deaths, all those indicators. You use the same indicators for India and correlate it with inequality in India. There is absolutely no correlation. What does that tell us? That the narratives that we're actually that Thomas Piketty is talking about, in the advanced economy is actually absolutely apt for them.
Right.
But we have to be very careful in trying to impute them for India. Number one. Number two, when it comes to inequality, and actually there's an example that and I think that this was an experiment that was done in one of the universities as well, which suppose, you've done an MBA, but so I'll give you this example using one of my pet shows. When I was a kid, we used to watch Malgudi Days. There was this character called Swami,
Right, of course.
quite a, amiable character. So in one of the episodes, if I remember right, Swami comes back, crying to his mother and says that, Amma, I'm not going to study mathematics anymore. And so the mother is actually a little troubled, saying, why? What happened? So he says, oh, the principal actually, I got 100 out of 100 on mathematics. The principal took 20 marks away from me and gave it to Shankar, who got only 60. Why? Because the principal wanted everybody to actually wanted to redistribute so that there could be equality. So here basically what do you see? Because 20 marks was taken away from him, now what Swami thinks is that there is no point in studying any more than getting 80 marks, because anyway he's going to lose them. So his incentive is dampened. Equally then, then the scene shifts and Shankar is basically going, very joyous. And he says, Amma, I don't need to study mathematics anymore. Because even if actually anyway 10 marks to 10-20 marks to ऐसे ही I'll get it, ऐसे ही आ जाएगा मेरा, और 20 marks anyway मुझे principal दे देंगे तो मैं पास ही हो जाऊंगा, तो मेरे को मेहनत करने की जरूरत नहीं है. His incentive is also dampened. So this is something, again, when you think deeply about these, if you do too much redistribution without actually capability creation, there is a difference between freebies versus actually welfare, which is freebies is like just doling out loaves of fish. Welfare is actually spending to create capabilities among the vulnerable sections of society. There's a difference between the two. This example that I gave you, taking 20 marks from let's say Swami and giving it to Shankar, that is just giving loaves of fish. That is freebies, and it dampens incentives. And that is important to understand whenever, and we have many institutions actually who all love to talk about, inequality without talking about something as basic as this. Also the fact that, the narratives, whatever evidence actually that prevails in advanced economies is not applicable for India. So I think the important point I'm making is, and that's why I've actually talked about 4 pillars, which is the first pillar is that we have to focus on growth and growth alone, macroeconomic level.
Right.
Second is social and economic inclusion, and there we need to spend on welfare. You spoke about, for instance, giving free food, and this is something I want to explain. Many people say, oh, that is it's a freebie. And here I want to give credit to the Honorable Prime Minister, because actually on one occasion there was a conversation. I said we did it during COVID and maybe we should stop it after that. And then something he said which actually made a lot of sense. I correlated with what Nobel laureate Gary Becker taught us in a class at the University of Chicago, and I'll explain. So he said, if you look at actually over the last 10 years, and now data also clearly shows poverty, there's been a significant reduction. So, using the consumption survey, and using the World Bank, GDP, the line for poverty line, which is $1.9 per capita per day in purchasing power parity terms, from 12.2%, the poverty has declined to 2.2%. Okay, so there's a large section of population that has basically come over this very basic poverty line, but they still remain vulnerable. Why? Because just one shock for them actually can get them back to poverty. And that shock could be a health shock, right? Could be some other shock. So it is, it's important to actually, sort of provide this safety net for a certain period of time, so that this benefit that has come, this poverty reduction that has happened, is sustained. And why is this important? Here's where as I said, I correlate with what I learned, from Professor Gary Becker. One of the most important things he taught us is that he says, his premise is it's not as if the poor are less smarter than the rich. That's not the case. It is just that their mindset, because they have to worry about today's food, they have to worry about, just today's needs. Their mindset cannot be long-term enough. So they basically think about the here and now. They focus, so much of the focus is where is my next, maybe my next loaf of bread is going to come from, where my next meal going to come from, my next salary or whatever, right? So the mindset is too, and it's true that things like education, etc., requires a long-term mindset. Right. You have to have actually saying, I will keep investing basically for 12 years of my life at least in education before I start earning, and that requires a long-term mindset. And the reason actually I find therefore the free food is important is because it provides a certain cushion, unlike in the advanced economies, which actually have a lot of welfare, they have the safety nets. We don't have as much safety nets. That is why free food is important. Ayushman Bharat, very important, because why? Because it provides, as I was telling you, one health shock can actually take a family, make it poor.
Right.
And there's now some good work actually. Shamika Ravi has, who's part of the Economic Advisory Council, has actually, Prime PM's Economic Advisory Council has tweeted about this too, that out-of-pocket spending actually on healthcare has declined significantly as a result of Ayushman Bharat. And, if you look at earlier data, a large section of the population, poor used to actually become poor because of these health shocks, and Ayushman Bharat is helping in this. So these are all actually things that I recognize and I think about as an economist as welfare that needs to be done in a country like India. These are not freebies. What is a freebie? A freebie is if you basically just say, okay, agriculture, I will basically continue giving you power at, zero, not charge you at all, and therefore the farmer, takes out water and actually depletes the water table. That is not welfare, because these are, and most of this is oftentimes going to rich farmers, that's an example of a freebie. If you go, for instance, and let's say in Bangalore, I'll give free bus tickets, again, that's a freebie. It's not necessarily enhancing capabilities, of the vulnerable. So the distinction I want to make is doling out loaves of fish versus teaching someone to fish. Doling out loaves of fish is basically is freebie. Welfare spending to actually teach someone fishing, building capabilities, that's welfare spending that is absolutely critical for a country like India, because we actually do have, people to uplift.
Right, I agree with that. So sir, एक और चीज़ जो मैंने देखी है, जो कई लोगों ने बोला भी है, कुछ बिजनेसमैन ने भी, एंटरप्रेन्योर्स ने, कि one of the reasons of slow pace of economic reforms in India is also its bureaucracy, because India don't have specialists. Journalists ज़्यादा है हमारे पास, and you have worked with government, of course, you have implemented a lot of reforms there. अभी जैसे गवर्नमेंट ने कोशिश किया था lateral entry का भी, they tried to do that, but not successfully. उस चीज़ को आपने क्या कैलकुलेट किया है अपने इस?
हाँ, मैंने पूरा एक चैप्टर लिखा हुआ है ब्यूरोक्रेटिक रिफॉर्म में इसमें एक्चुअली, बिकॉज मुझे और ब्यूरोक्रेटिक रिफॉर्म और जुडिशरी रिफॉर्म ऑफ द जुडिशरी दोनों बहुत अहम है, क्योंकि ये दोनों एक्चुअली, और जुडिशियल रिफॉर्म इसलिए बहुत ज़रूरी है क्योंकि एनफोर्समेंट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट किसी भी मार्केट इकोनॉमी में जब आपके कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स एक्चुअली जल्दी एनफोर्स होते हैं, मान लीजिए आपका आपने एक कोई भी इकोनॉमिक में फ्रॉड किया, कि आप नहीं करेंगे बट कोई और मतलब कोई फलाना ढिमकाना व्यक्ति करे, तो उसको एक्चुअली यदि उसको पता है कि मैं सिर्फ 3 महीने में ये एक्चुअली वर्डिक्ट आ जाएगी और मैं जेल जा सकता हूं, तो फिर वो डरेगा। लेकिन वो यदि उसको पता है, अरे मैं तो कर रहा हूँ 20-25 साल तो ऐसे ही निकाल लूंगा, तारीख पे तारीख करके मैं 3 महीने निकाल लूंगा 30 साल, तो यार ठीक है, देखा जाएगा यार। वो जब तो जो इम्प्यूनिटी आती है कि एक्चुअली चलो कुछ नहीं होगा, चलता है टाइप्स, तो ये इसीलिए एनफोर्समेंट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स जो है किसी मार्केट इकोनॉमी में बहुत जरूरी है। और इसमें इसलिए जुडिशियल रिफॉर्म, उसमें जो बैकलॉग है, केस के बैकलॉग, उसको कम करना, जिसके लिए मैंने जो एक्चुअली उपाय बताए हैं, बहुत ऐसा नहीं है कि इसको एक्चुअली हिमालय को हिलाने वाला उपाय नहीं है एक्चुअली, काफ़ी सरल से ही है, जिसको करा जा सकता है, और जुडिशरी एक्चुअली मन लगा ले तो एक्चुअली इसको कर लेगी। अब आपने ब्यूरोक्रेटिक रिफॉर्म के बारे में पूछा, इसमें एक्चुअली मैं एक उदाहरण देना चाहता हूँ आपको। 2014 में बिल गेट्स ने मैग्नस कार्लसन को एक चेस गेम के लिए चैलेंज किया था।
राइट।
अब बिल गेट्स तो बहुत ही काबिल व्यक्ति हैं, और हम लोगों सबको लगेगा कि अरे बिल गेट्स तो एक्चुअली एकदम टक्कर देंगे मैग्नस कार्लसन को, तो मैग्नस कार्लसन वर्ल्ड चैंपियन हुए तो क्या हुआ, लेकिन बिल गेट्स भी तो एकदम बहुत दिग्गज इंसान है। लेकिन पता है आपको क्या हुआ उसमें? एक्चुअली बिल गेट्स मैग्नस कार्लसन से सिर्फ 44 सेकंड में हार गए। 44 सेकंड। सोचो, मैं और आप खेले यहाँ पे, और आप मेरे को 44 सेकंड में एक्चुअली चेस के गेम में हरा दो, तो मुझे तो चुल्लू भर पानी में डूब मरना चाहिए ना। तो ये इसलिए बता रहा हूं कि एक्चुअली अब चेस में मैग्नस कार्लसन जो है वो स्पेशलिस्ट है, बिल गेट्स चेस के मामले में तो जनरलिस्ट है। और इसी तरह एक्चुअली अब इसको रिवर्स करके सोचें, तो यदि मैग्नस कार्लसन बिल गेट्स को सॉफ्टवेयर में चैलेंज करते, तो बिल गेट्स उनका वैसे ही भुर्ता बना देते जैसे उन्होंने इसमें चेस में बनाया। तो ये जो है स्पेशलिस्ट और जनरलिस्ट की एक इसमें जो एक प्रतिस्पर्धा जब होती है तो स्पेशलिस्ट वो एक्चुअली उसमें भारी पड़ता है। तो ये इस चीज को समझना हमें जरूरी है। और इसीलिए जो ब्यूरोक्रेटिक रिफॉर्म है उसको उसमें स्पेशलिस्ट को उसमें जोर देना। और मैंने एक्चुअली आपने कहा मैं सरकार मैंने अपने अनुभव से देखा है जो सेक्रेटरीज एक्चुअली मैंने चंद सेक्रेटरीज के साथ काम किया जिनमें जो स्पेशलिस्ट थे उन्होंने बहुत अच्छा काम किया। और मैं इसमें उदाहरण दे सकता हूँ एक्चुअली। अब जैसे अजय भूषण पांडे जी रेवेन्यू सेक्रेटरी थे, एक्चुअली वो IIT के CS हैं, उसके बाद फिर कार्नेगी मेलन में जाके CS में PhD किया है उन्होंने। और तो उन्होंने जिस तरह की रिफॉर्म्स लाया एक्चुअली इसमें आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस मशीन लर्निंग वगैरह लगा के इसमें GST में, तो स्पेशलिस्ट थे एक्चुअली, समझ पाते थे एक्चुअली। इसलिए ऐसे ही आप देखें अभी जो कैबिनेट सेक्रेटरी बने हैं सोमनाथन जी, तो ये वो PhD इकोनॉमिक्स में, तो जिस तरह उनकी समझ है इकोनॉमिक्स में एक्चुअली उससे उनसे बड़ा आनंद आता था कि समझते थे विषयों को। वैसे ही तरुण बजाज एक्चुअली IMA के प्रोडक्ट हैं तो वो समझते हैं। तो जो स्पेशलिस्ट होता है तो इससे, और मैं मतलब आपको ये कार्लसन और बिल गेट्स का जो उदाहरण है और अपने पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस से भी बता रहा हूं, तो ये साफ है कि स्पेशलिस्ट जितने ज्यादा आएंगे, और इस सरकार ने उसमें उस डायरेक्शन में काम किया है, लेकिन अभी और काम करना जरूरी है उसमें। और सबसे आपने जो अभी उदाहरण दिया अभी रिसेंटली जो हुआ इस रिसेंट अभी इसमें लैटरल एंट्री का, मेरे अनुसार लैटरल एंट्री जो है हाईएस्ट लेवल सेक्रेटरी लेवल पे होना जरूरी है। क्योंकि जो एजेंडा है किसी भी डिपार्टमेंट में तो हेड ऑफ द डिपार्टमेंट सेट करता है, तो वो काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है। तो ये जो कंपटीशन है वो एट द हाईएस्ट लेवल सेक्रेटरी लेवल पे होनी चाहिए पहले। और यदि आप देखें काबिलियत भी प्रतिस्पर्धा से बनती है। ये जो हमारे जो IAS ऑफिसर आते हैं ये एक्चुअली इतनी मुश्किल एक सिविल सर्विसेज एग्जाम, शायद देश में इतना मुश्किल एग्जाम सिर्फ IIT JEE एक और एग्जाम है शायद जो इतना डिफिकल्ट है। तो ऐसे एग्जाम से प्रतिस्पर्धा करके आते हैं, तो इसीलिए इतने काबिल होते हैं जब वो आते हैं। तो लेकिन हमारी सिस्टम अभी ऐसी है कि जब जॉइंट सेक्रेटरी लेवल में वो प्रतिस्पर्धा नहीं है, बाहर से जो स्पेशलिस्ट की जो कंपटीशन है वो नहीं है, तो इसीलिए जो स्पेशलिस्ट को लाने के लिए वो कंपटीशन जरूरी है। लेकिन ये फेयर होना चाहिए। फेयर किस तरह कि ये ना लगे कि हम ब्यूरोक्रेट्स को, अरे हमने तो मेहनत किया था भैया, हमने सिविल सर्विसेज क्लियर किया, और ये जो लोग हैं जिन्होंने सिविल सर्विसेज के लिए मेहनत भी नहीं किया अब आ रहे हैं, अब एक्चुअली हमारा जो हक है वो हमसे छीन रहे हैं, ऐसा नहीं लगना चाहिए। तो इसीलिए इसमें ये बहुत अहम है कि हमारे जो ब्यूरोक्रेट्स हैं उनको भी अपॉर्चुनिटी दी जाए कि वो जाके प्राइवेट सेक्टर में काम करें। तो इसके लिए जैसे मैंने उसमें रिफॉर्म्स पे,
क्या इसमें बेटर सोल्यूशन वुड नॉट बी कि UPSC लेवल पे ही सुधार किया जाए जब हम सिलेक्शन कर रहे हैं?
नहीं, यूपीएससी वो तो एग्जाम में काफी अच्छा कंपटीशन के साथ होता है वो। लेकिन मैं ये बोल रहा हूँ कि एक्चुअली आपका जब सेक्रेटरी लेवल, जॉइंट सेक्रेटरी लेवल जब बनते हैं तो वहां पे स्पेशलिस्ट का भी यदि स्पेशलिस्ट आना है तो इनको भी अपॉर्चुनिटी दी जानी चाहिए कि जिस तरह एक्चुअली यदि अब प्राइवेट सेक्टर में जो लोग स्पेशलिस्ट हैं उन्होंने प्राइवेट सेक्टर में काम कर लिया, अब उनको लगता है सरकार में जाके काम करना है, सरकार में जाके देश के लिए योगदान देना है, लगता है मान लीजिए, तो वैसे ही हमारे सरकार वाले में जो काम करते हैं उनको भी ये अपॉर्चुनिटी होना चाहिए कि हमने देश के लिए योगदान दिया, अभी हम जाके प्राइवेट सेक्टर में भी जाते हैं, अपने लिए कुछ कैपेबिलिटी कम कर लेते हैं और सैलरी अच्छी होगी वो भी कमा। तो ये दोनों तरफ इट शुड बी बैलेंस्ड, एंड दैट इज व्हाई सिर्फ एक तरफा होगा तो रेजिस्टेंस होगी। तो इसीलिए एंड दूसरी तरफ एक और बताता हूं एक्चुअली कि जब आप दोनों तरफ देखते हो तो आपका जो पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है फार मोर बैलेंस्ड होता है। क्योंकि जैसे अब कई लोगों को लगता है, सरकार में जो रहते हैं उनको लगता है कि हर एक व्यक्ति जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर में काम करता है सिर्फ पैसे के पीछे भागता है, मतलब स्टीरियोटाइप है, ऐसा नहीं है, हर एक कोई नहीं कहता, बट स्टीरियोटाइप है। ऐसे ही आप देखेंगे तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर में स्टीरियोटाइप होता है कि अरे जो सरकार में है वो फलाना है ढिमकाना है वैसे। तो जब लेकिन अब मैंने प्राइवेट सेक्टर में भी काम किया, मैंने सरकार में भी काम किया है, और मैंने देखा है कि दोनों स्टीरियोटाइप गलत हैं। सरकार में भी ऐसे बहुत लोग हैं जो एक्चुअली बहुत ही काबिल हैं, ऐसे ही प्राइवेट सेक्टर में भी ऐसे बहुत सारे लोग हैं जो पैसे के लिए काम नहीं करते। उनको या फिर उनको आनंद आता है जो काम करते हैं, या फिर वो कुछ योगदान देना चाहते हैं। तो ये जब दोनों में इंटरमिंगलिंग होती है कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर में जाके हमारे अधिकारी जो है वो काम करें, वैसे ही प्राइवेट सेक्टर से भी आके काम इसमें हो, तो ये जो मिंगलिंग है इससे स्टीरियोटाइप से ब्रेक होंगी और एक्सपर्टीज दोनों साइड बढ़ेगा। तो इसीलिए ये इंपॉर्टेंट है, ये बैलेंस होना जरूरी है कि सो दैट रेजिस्टेंस ना हो। और रेजिस्टेंस इसलिए ना हो, इसलिए होती है, वाजिब है कि हमने मेहनत किया है और मेहनत करके हम इसीलिए इसमें आए, तो अब आके अब हमारा जो हक है वो छीना जा रहा है। यदि ऐसा लगे तो एक्चुअली ये रिफॉर्म नहीं होगा।
राइट, ओके। तो सर ये बुक पढ़ने के बाद इवन आई थॉट दैट इंडिया शुड अचीव दिस, एंड जो थॉट मेरे दिमाग में आया, बहुत सारे लोगों के दिमाग में जो आएगा वो है कि इंडिविजुअल लेवल पे एक इंसान क्या कर, बिकॉज आई थिंक इट्स ऑलमोस्ट लाइक अ पेट्रियोटिक ड्यूटी, इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट जो लोग समझते ही नहीं, बट इट्स अ पेट्रियोटिक ड्यूटी दैट योर कंट्री शुड अचीव दैट एंड यू शुड कंट्रीब्यूट टू दैट।
यस,
सो व्हाट शुड अ पर्सनस टास्क शुड बी, उसके क्या ड्यूटीज होना चाहिए?
ये बहुत अच्छा सवाल है एक्चुअली। ये मैंने काफ़ी इंटरव्यूज़ दिए हैं, इसमें ये सवाल किसी ने नहीं पूछा है, तो बहुत अच्छा आपने एक्चुअली ये सवाल पूछा है कि देखिए इसमें मैं इस सवाल का जवाब बहुत तरीक़ों में दे सकता हूँ, लेकिन मैं हमारी संस्कृति से जोड़ के इसको जवाब दूंगा। यदि आप देखें सनातन धर्म में जो 4 पुरुषार्थ कहे गए हैं, उसमें धर्म, अर्थ, काम, मोक्ष, उसमें अपने धर्म का पालन करना, अपने धर्म का यानी कि अपना आप जो काम आप कर रहे हैं उसको पूरी श्रद्धा से करें, पहला ये करें तो उससे देश का योगदान होता है। क्योंकि आप अच्छा काम कर रहे हैं, जो आप टैक्स देते हैं, जब बाकी कुछ भी ना करें तो भी प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाला जो टैक्स देता है वो देश में काम आता है, क्योंकि वो 100 रुपये में 30 रुपया यदि देता है, तो जो अभी कोविड के समय में जो खाना दिया गया, फ्री फूड जो दिया गया, या फिर जो बिल्डिंग्स बनती हैं, इतना सारा इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, एयरपोर्ट्स बने हैं, पोर्ट्स बने, ये जो टैक्स पेयर आपके पैसे के बिना तो नहीं बन सकता, तो टैक्स पेयर बाकी कुछ भी ना करे तो भी जब एक जो नौकरशाही व्यक्ति जब काम करता है अपना और टैक्स देता है तभी योगदान दे रहा है। तो सबसे पहला तो एक्चुअली वो अपना जो धर्म है वो एकदम निष्ठा के साथ और तत्परता के साथ निभाए, वो सबसे पहला। दूसरा, यदि आपको एक्चुअली यदि इससे भी बेहतर मेरे अनुसार यदि आप एक नई फर्म शुरू कर सकते हैं, मान लीजिए आप में वो एंटरप्रेन्योरियल कैपेबिलिटी, आप में वो जुनून है, तो आप जब वो करते हैं तो आप अपने लिए तो अच्छा करते ही करते हैं, लेकिन आप बहुत लोगों को रोजगार देते हैं। और रोजगार से एक्चुअली मैं अपने ही अनुभव से बताता हूँ कि हमारे पिताजी, मैं तो जैसे मैं पहले बता रहा था, मैं बहुत साधारण परिवार से आता हूँ। हमारे पिताजी यदि रेलवेज में क्लरिकल ग्रेड में यदि वो नहीं ज्वाइन करते तो मेरे को और मेरे भाई को पढ़ा नहीं पाते। तो आज के तारीख में मैं जो मैंने जीवन में जो आनंद आया है, जो मैं कर पाया हूँ, वो एक्चुअली मैं कर नहीं पाता। ऐसे ही नहीं इसके क्योंकि मैं पढ़ पाया इसलिए मेरे बच्चे भी पढ़ पा रहे हैं, और एक्चुअली कितने 1-2-3 पीढ़ियों को फायदा आया है। तो ये रोजगार का जो है इतना बड़ा लाभ है। तो जो एंटरप्रेन्योर है वो एक्चुअली उसको एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप की यदि उसका जुनून है तो नया फर्म क्रिएट करे, इंडिया के प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करे। तो इंडिया के प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करे तो वो बहुत तरीकों में योगदान दे रहा है। क्यों? क्योंकि एक पहले वो एक्चुअली इंडिया के प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व कर रहा है, दूसरा इंडिया के प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करते हुए रोजगार बना रहा है, तीसरा जो प्रॉफिट्स आती है उससे टैक्स दे रहा है, चौथा जो एम्प्लॉइज जो रोजगार है वो टैक्स देते हैं। तो 4 से एक्चुअली जो देश का योगदान होता है। तो ये समझना जरूरी है कि एंटरप्रेन्योर, मेरे अनुसार तो मैं तो मानता हूं एक्चुअली मैं पॉलिसी मेकर हूं, मैं नया फर्म क्रिएट नहीं कर पाया, लेकिन मैं तो एक्चुअली नेशनल सर्विस में एंटरप्रेन्योर को, वेल्थ क्रिएटर, प्रमोट, इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट को पॉलिसी मेकर से भी ऊंचा रखता हूं, क्योंकि वो रोजगार देते हैं। और रोजगार सबसे अहम है किसी भी परिवार के लिए, क्योंकि एक परिवार में सिर्फ एक व्यक्ति का यदि अच्छा नौकरी लगता है तो सारा परिवार एक्चुअली जो है उसमें समृद्धि आ जाती है। तो जो यानी कि मैं एक दूसरे तरीके से बताऊं तो एक्चुअली आप यदि मैं पॉलिसी मेकर हूं, आप मुझे रात के 3 बजे उठाओ और बोलो कि एक्चुअली आप धक्का देके बोलो कि आप पॉलिसी मेकर हो, आपको किस कारण नींद नहीं आती, तो मैं बोलूंगा मैं तीन कारण बताऊं, बोलूंगा रोजगार, रोजगार और रोजगार। क्योंकि सबसे अहम हमारी जो आबादी है, अभी एक यंग आबादी है, यंग पॉपुलेशन है, तो रोजगार। इसीलिए मेरे अनुसार एक्चुअली एंटरप्रेन्योर जो है सबसे अच्छा पॉलिसी मेकर से भी सबसे जो जॉब क्रिएशन करता है। तो आप यदि आप अपना बस यही करें कि आप अपना, यदि आप एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप नया फर्म शुरू कर सकते हैं तो आप वो करें, और उसमें एक्चुअली जुनून से अच्छा और देश के प्रॉब्लम्स को सॉल्व करें और उसमें अपना पैसा बनाएं। शुभ लाभ, शुभ करें और उससे लाभ बनाएं। अब लेकिन आप ऐसा आपको वो आप नहीं करना है, आपको नौकरी करनी है, तो उस नौकरी को पूरी तत्परता से, पूरी निष्ठा से वो करें। तो एक्चुअली ये हमारे इसमें भी, अब किसी भी रिलीजन में ले लें तो यही बताया जाता है कि अपने धर्म को, स्वयं धर्म को एक्चुअली अच्छे तरीके से करें। तो उसमें जो सेटिस्फैक्शन है, पर्सनल सेटिस्फैक्शन है, 8 घंटे आपने एक्चुअली उसमें जो अपना पूरा खून पसीना दिया, उसके बाद शाम को जब जा रहे हैं आप, तो एक अरे आज का काम हमने अच्छे, मतलब एकदम अच्छे तरीके से किया, तो इतना करें तो बस काफ़ी है।
Okay, sir, thanks a lot for joining us, and it was a great conversation, and congratulations for this book.
Thank you so much. If you want to understand why India at 100, when India turns 100 in 2047, will be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy, read India at 100. Thank you very much.